quite natural relevant. It was really nice. Hi everyone. Good morning. I'm Melanie. I'm from kind of everything. I'm the kind of integration and welcome. My name is Steve. I'm the foundation. Yeah, thank you for being here. So I think the important thing is that part of the undertaking is because with us for any sessions today. Um, if you have a chance to look at the agenda today, then you'd like to look at the table, just find it. Today I want to do a privilege, looking at understanding working through trauma, and workshop with Nikki Fishar. We also got fish with myself and Michelle this afternoon, looking at the idea of power, we can really how we feel with the questions. And then we probably will be having a presentation today, which is thinking and trying to understand what the online education should look like. Yeah, we could all do things. I'm just going to introduce all the panelists first, and then I'll give them the opportunity to share a little bit about their work with you all, and what they understand decolonising education as, and then we'll be opening up space to have more of a discussion. I really care about discussions like this, not being a knowledge producer, knowledge receiver, but rather being a space where people can share their own knowledge in the space, as well as being able to ask questions to panelists. So feel free to be as conversational and as vocal as you'd like to be in the session. So I'll start off by introducing Aminata, who is a young champion at the Black Curriculum. They're a final year international relations student at SOAS, and the president of the Afro-Caribbean Society. She is a research and infographics officer at the Black Curriculum, where she contributes to research supporting the organisation's work, advocating for the inclusion of Black British history in UK national curriculums, and promoting a more inclusive understanding of Britain's past. She is also the co-founder of Young People in Development, a platform focused on amplifying youth perspectives on development and political economy. There we go. Second of all, we've got Nabil Khan, who is a fifth-year medical student at the University of Exeter, whose academic and leadership portfolio centres on health equity, dermatology education, and structural reform within healthcare curricula. She is the founder of Skin for All, an evidence-informed educational resource designed to improve the representation of diverse skin tones in dermatology teaching. The platform now features over 30 dermatological conditions and has reached more than 10,000 page views and 4,000 unique users to date. Nabil's academic contributions include being invited to TED Talks in the NHS, the British Medical Association, Student Conference, and the University of Exeter Medical School, and multiple national medical education meetings. She has served as a student representative and advocate across several institutional and national committees, influencing policies related to equality, diversity, and inclusive curriculum development. Thirdly, we've got Dr. Isabel Higgins, who is a teaching associate in media and culture and sociological theory. Isabel is interested in studying empirical sites in which emerging forms of technology are made sense of and used by people in their everyday lives. She draws on a range of social theory to critically interrogate the power relations and expressions of social inequality that are reflected, refracted, reproduced, or challenged in such empirical locations. And finally, we have Selina Dragos, who is based at the University of Cambridge, where she is a research fellow at Queen's College and affiliated lecturer at the Department of Sociology. Her research addresses nationalism as a vehicle for coloniality and sits at the intersection of the sociology of race, political sociology, critical education studies, and memory studies. Together with Dr. Ali Medji, she co-founded the Catalyst for Decolonisation Lab at the Cambridge Centre for Research in Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities. She teaches on decoloniality, eugenics, nationalism, settler colonialism, and the construction of Europe. So with all our panel members introduced, Samina, do you mind if I ask you to introduce yourself first?
Yeah. So hi everyone, thank you for inviting me, Melanie, and thank you all of you for being here. Is it alright if I just speak for a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, it's great to be here, and I thought I'd just introduce who I am and how I came to this work and what it means to me. So, I'm obviously a white East European, maybe you didn't know I'm an East European woman, but basically I came to England from the East of Europe at 19 to study here at Cambridge. And that was sort of my way into these questions because I didn't have a word for it, or I didn't have a label for it when I first arrived here, but it was a completely different world, and I felt there were very clear hierarchies of worth, of knowledge, of perspective, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, I was studying education studies at the Faculty of Education here at Cambridge, and I felt like none of what we were learning resonated with my experience or with the context I came from, right? So post-socialist societies, post-dictatorship societies. And after a while, in my second year, I came together with some other students who felt the same, even though they were from different contexts, and we were particularly frustrated at the way the primary assumption of our degree seemed to be that the UK is the center of the world, and you should know, for example, the UK education system, because that should be sort of a standard. Obviously, we were studying education, so that seemed particularly relevant. At the same time, staff in the Faculty of Education and across the university were developing the first Decolonizing the Curriculum open letter, which I think came out in 2017, but I'm not entirely sure on the date. And one of the staff involved with that was one of my mentor, my DOS at the time, Alatis Prakash, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Oxford now. And so, through conversations, the student perspectives and the staff perspectives sort of merged in 2017, 2018, when we started having a few conversations in the faculty more broadly about decolonizing the curriculum. At the same time, the movement Why is my curriculum white and Roads from School had been going on, so these were student movements that I was learning about and thinking about in my curriculum at the faculty, because some staff did try to introduce critical conversations into the curriculum and destabilize the UK, destabilize whiteness, and so on and so forth. So these were sort of my early interactions with the notion of decolonization and the sort of early texts I encountered. Also really important to me and really formative was the fact that in those last 2 years of my undergraduate, there were talks here at Cambridge by Angela Davis, Patricia Hill Collins, and Raymond Connell. And those really were super formative to my thinking more broadly and to my academic trajectory, but also really brought to the forefront the importance of carrying on these conversations in our learning place. And then when I was a master's student, I did a master's in international development, and together with other students, again, we felt really frustrated at the sort of hierarchies and ideologies embedded in our study and the idea of international development, like what international development really meant. And it was also really clear that most of us were not from the UK, were coming to the UK to learn about international development, and it was a really weird sort of dynamic, a racialized dynamic, which was sort of trying to teach us about progress and modernity and societal development. Now this was in 2019, and of course my master's was 2019 to 2020, and in the summer of 2020, the movement for Black Lives really gained prominence. And in that process, again, learning from a social movement, a bunch of us got together and wrote an open letter to our faculty about racism in the Faculty of Education and racism in these perspectives on the international development as well. Since then, there have been multiple initiatives and open letters and texts that people have written about international development and education as a field, like the making of this field of comparative and international development. But more broadly, what this did was create a community of students who were thinking about these things together and were trying to work towards undoing the structures of inequality within our own faculty. So this carried on through my PhD years. And all of this was, I wasn't necessarily like a leader, or it was all very communal and very, it was brought about through conversation between people, is what I'm trying to say. And then towards the end of my PhD, my supervisor was Dr. Meji, who was interested in questions of decolonization as well. And towards the end of my PhD, he proposed that we start this research lab together, which is based at Crash here at the university, called Catalyst for Decolonization. And again, one of the purposes of this lab is to bring people together across the university who have this interest in decolonization, interest in questions of imperialism and empire, and also their afterlives. And particularly to think about the history of decolonization as a key driver of 20th century history. So rather than thinking of it as a sort of outcome of the big events or the big people in the 20th century, thinking about the fight for decolonization as central to the other events in the 20th century that we typically learn about at school or more broadly. So this is just very briefly what I've been involved with so far. Now, in my own teaching, I teach on a course called Sociology of Empire, so everything to do with empire and imperialism is pretty central to how I teach the topics that I have academic expertise on, or some academic expertise on. But more broadly, the texts that I've interacted with and the struggles that I learned about made me create a practice of questioning my teaching and what it means to exist well within the University of Cambridge in itself, but also what it means to be an educator, and an educator more broadly. And this is still something I'm constantly reflecting on, and I feel like I don't necessarily have the perfect formula, but some things that are really important for me is not being punitive, so refusing the university as a sort of like policing institution of knowledge or otherwise of students, but also trying my best to fight against the hostile environment, so that is the migration regime of the United Kingdom, which polices international students in particular. Now, this did not apply to me specifically because the country I'm from, Romania, is a member of the European Union, and we have differentiated status in the United Kingdom because of the United Kingdom having been a member of the European Union. So from the get-go, I was very viscerally aware of the hierarchies of migrants, basically, that were operationalized within the United Kingdom, at least at the point where I came in 2016, which is no longer entirely the case. But yeah, I think it's really important to be aware of how government policies that are racist and continue colonial legacies impact what we do in the university as well, including policing migrants' behavior and migrants' movement. And I think I'm going to stop here because I feel like, I don't want to take too much space, and we can talk about any of this.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Samira. I wonder if Isabel would like to introduce herself.
Sure. Hi everyone. I recognise a few people, lots of you I don't recognise, so it's nice to meet you. Thank you for being here. And my name is Isabel Higgins. I teach in the Department of Sociology. And kind of, I guess it's hard to think about the best way to introduce what decolonisation means and how I became interested to it. So I'm just going to, kind of similar to Samina, do some events in roughly chronological order. I guess the first thing to say is that, so when I was an undergraduate here, so I did my undergraduate degree, master's and PhD in the sociology department, and now I teach in the department. And I started my undergraduate degree, I took 4 years out of education between secondary school and starting to study, and then I just kind of went the whole way through. But when I was an undergraduate here, so the late 2016 to 2019, there was this movement for decolonisation kind of growing and spreading. Lola Olufemi wrote an open letter that became very widely known. A number of things happened in this history, particularly of decolonisation at Cambridge, as Samina said, that linked to and diverged from kind of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, what was going on at Oxford and other universities. So beginning there in decolonised sociology, I at the same time kind of realised that I really liked academia, and after being sure that I wouldn't, and that I wouldn't probably want to stay in education, realised that I really did want to, and began to study an empirical side that felt where I felt like insights from decolonial theory were very useful. So in short, my PhD research looked at how adoption in the USA, so the ways in which people use the internet to encourage the adoption of children in the USA, links to long-standing relations of power and inequality. So within the US, government-funded websites exist where users can search for children on the basis of their racial identity, age, gender, types of disabilities, and on clicking search on these interfaces, often photographs and first names and detailed descriptions appear in the public domain. So this information isn't necessarily kind of kept private. So I was looking at that, and I was also looking at people who promoted adoption on social media. And one group of actors promoting adoption on social media, we're now into kind of like 2019 to 2022, at that time were mums who were working as social media influencers. So these tended to be white women who'd adopted children of colour and then built their careers being influencers. And one of the things they might monetize is their things about their child's skin, their child's difficulties becoming adopted, being adopted, their child's struggles to learn English, for example. And so I found decolonial theory in combination with critical race theory really, really helpful to try and interrogate some of these realities. And the first academic paper I wrote was based upon doing those things, and it was a paper based on my MPhil research. At that time, I also went to the Library of Congress in Washington, DC. Now we're in 2022. So this is when the Dobbs v. Jackson was kind of overturned, or Roe v. Wade was overturned effectively by Dobbs v. Jackson. So reproductive rights became like a really hot button topic. I was living and working in DC, and I was having a lot of really interesting and often harrowing experiences looking for images of children of colour in the archives. So I was interested in historic contexts where children of colour were being monetised for mass audiences characterised by whiteness. And one of the experiences that I ended up writing about as a result of doing that research was the experience of myself being mixed race, white British and Afro-Caribbean, though being very white passing, and having the experience of finding this harrowing material in the archive and entering and leaving library spaces with a certain level of ease. And in a paper I wrote, a chapter I wrote for an edited volume on decolonising bodies, that's the title of the book with Bloomsbury Academics, it's a really interesting anthology. I wrote about how this ability to move in and out of the library was probably, at least in part, based upon the visuality of my body, right, which is different from the visuality of my brother's body and my cousin's body and their potential ease or not ease of entering and exiting library spaces. And so there was kind of the academic and partially like other forms of thinking related to decolonisation that I was engaging with, although I would question the barrier, like I've just created a boundary in my speaking between like academic forms of decolonisation and other forms, and I don't think that those things are really particularly separable, and I think a lot of scholars of decoloniality or of social justice movements in general would say the same. But when I came back to Cambridge after that fieldwork, I was fortunate enough to be able to design and deliver some research methods training for graduate students on decoloniality and research methods, which was the first kind of training of its type here, and more recently have been designing teaching for our undergraduate students, and running a research cluster thinking about sociology, visual art and film, and also a discussion group called Complexities of Racialisation in the UK, where those of us thinking about the specificities of racial inequality and the intersectional nature of racism in the UK in our research, you kind of come together to discuss that. I should also say for the last few years I've been working on a project with an amazing group of student researchers who I see fully as like co-collaborators on the project, to try and kind of categorise or at least archive all of the decolonisation efforts that have taken place in the university since 2015, because there have been a huge number, and many of them have been led by women of colour in particular, and most of them have been led unpaid. And I think it's really important that we recognise the amazing work that students have and continue to do in this field, and try and think about the impact it's had over time, because from when Samina and I began as undergraduates to now, I do think obviously racialisation and racism and forms of inequality maintain incredible structuring power, but it does feel to me as if both the wider context outside the university and the teaching and learning environments in the university have perhaps a little bit at least shifted, and I'd be interested to know, Samina, what you think of that. So I think, yeah, how do we like recognise and honour those shifts while still pushing for things to be different is a question I'm thinking about a lot at the moment, and I'll stop there.
Brilliant, thank you so much.
You're
Thank you for both Samina and Isabel for framing the landscape of decolonisation work in Cambridge. I think it's really helpful for us to know how to situate ourselves in the current context and the work that's happened over the past few years. But I've also invited others to share the wider context of work that's happening across the British landscape. So if you'd like to go ahead now.
Of course, I don't know how I'm going to follow either of you, because that was incredible. But I'm Marble, I'm a final year medical student. This is a bit of a rant, it's a bit of a full circle moment for me, because I like to joke whenever I come to Cambridge. I was rejected from Cambridge, so it's always nice to come back and speak to you. But it's nice being here, and thank you so much for inviting me as well. It's truly an honour. I, as Melanie mentioned, I'm a medical student, but I'm also an advocate, and I work around decolonising the medical curriculum. So my journey started in sixth form actually, when the pandemic hit, and seeing the inequalities. We watched the 10 o'clock news on the BBC, you see Chris Whitty going through the mortality rates of black and ethnic minority staff members as well as patients, and for me I felt incredibly hopeless. And so when I got to university and I said I have this platform in medical school to actually make a change for patient populations, I wanted to do that. And so I created my own website. The reason for me creating my own website, I'm not going down the traditional paths of finding grants, trying to go with universities. I found that there was a lot of red tape when it came to decolonisation efforts, especially at the university. And this isn't a means of knocking my university, I love it, it's great, but I think it speaks to a wider picture of decolonisation as a whole and trying to implement decolonisation practices. So that was all the way in 2023, and since then, the organisation that I've run has primarily been self-funded. And I think that was a very intentional effort for me, purely because I wanted to step away from institutional reliance, and I find that a lot of decolonisation practices and decolonial practices do rely on institutions to give you funding. And I was doing a bit of reading over the last few months about how funding and research and a lot of these grassroots organisations do rely on certain pots of money that are very much run by the same types of people. You've got NICE, you've got the BMJ, you've got these big organisations that not only run within the country but run globally as well. And so I made a concerted effort to make sure that this organisation was very much grassroots, very much student-led, and so it was dynamic in line with how students were shifting in their learning and how they were transitioning from pre-medical learning to clinical learning. And so that's just a rough intro to my organisation. Since then, I've been involved in policy work, so I co-reviewed the Decolonising Medicine and Dentistry Framework, which is now being used by the Medical Schools Council, and I think that was an incredible honour, but it spoke to how much we needed to do as a country and as an educational institute, not only at Exeter, but globally as well. And I think, looking at Skinfall and seeing the reception it's gained, it shows that there is a demand for diversity in medicine and medical education. Thankfully, we're moving from this paternalistic mindset of the doctor tells you what to do to a more collaborative mindset, and I think that needs to trickle into education itself as well. And so that's what I'm trying to do with the organisation. It started as a website, but it has turned into more of a movement where I've encouraged other students, not only from Exeter, but from places like Cambridge, all the way up in Scotland, in Ireland, even as far as America, where I was able to go to Washington DC as well and talk about my work and try and incentivise students to take on their own grassroots initiatives to try and decolonise their own spaces. Because I think, again, my point about the red tape being there, especially when you're trying to have the systemic change, it's really, really important that we get the students who are living the experiences of a colonial curriculum, they're living the experiences of a colonial medical system, to actually say, what do we need to change? And so through that process as well, I've been able to present at different medical conferences, not just medical but non-medical as well, and it led to the creation of my book, which is called Skinfall the Book, very unoriginally, and that covers over 100 skin conditions which focus on different skin types, and it really just decenters whiteness, which is what I'm really trying to do within my work and really trying to put forward within medicine and medical education itself. And I was able to, I had the honour of being able to do a TEDx NHS talk
where I talked about this, and the reception I got from that was fairly mixed. And I think, again, it very much speaks to the climate of the country at the moment. You know, I don't just think about my work as a university-focused movement, I think about it as a national movement, sometimes an international movement. And the reception was very polarised. You know, I got some people saying, you know, we don't need this, racism doesn't exist anymore in the country. And then I've got other people saying, no, I've had this harrowing experience of interacting with a doctor that potentially doesn't look like me, and I want to feel seen, I want to feel heard. And so I'm really trying to push forward that movement of we need patients, medics, non-medics to have this conversation about decolonising education, but then also clinical practice itself, because we can't do it alone. It shouldn't just be reliant on the medics, it shouldn't just be reliant on the patients, it should be a collaborative movement. So that's a bit about me.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Nadia. And finally, Aminata.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. I think I'm going to preface with a lot of my work. So I'm here as a representative of the Black curriculum, which came about in 2020 after the killing of George Floyd. So the CEO of the Virginia Senate saw that there was a fundamental issue in representation and education for Black children, and it essentially has been working to build that up. But I think personally, I like to think that I didn't choose decolonialism, but decolonialism chose me. So I grew up in the French education system as well as the British one, and across both of them, the common thread was a lack of representation. And I think genuinely from primary school up until university today, that has been one of the biggest issues that I faced within my education. And so that's what essentially what pushed me to work with the Black curriculum. So at the moment we're conducting research on the correlation between representation and engagement for Black students and how that's possibly going to affect their performance throughout the rest of the years. But within my work at Young People in Development, so throughout my life I've always been the minority in the room, like, just accept it. But I did find that at university I sort of had to be the one teaching my lecturers about Africa, even though I go to the School of Oriental and African Studies. So having to be the representative for an entire continent does fall hard on shoulders, and it wasn't until my second year that I had my first Black tutor. And so we discussed it, and he said the only way for progress to happen is for you to take action. So along with 3 of my colleagues, we decided to create Young People in Development for us to talk about our lived experiences in development instead of looking at sort of a top-down perspective. So I think subaltern studies and subaltern perspectives really underline all of my work. And so, yeah, the whole point of Young People in Development is for us to sort of take our experiences and our experiences of development. And I think the one thing that really, I think, pushed it was an incident. I think it was in class, and someone said that Africa was particularly like whipped on China, so that they hadn't realised that there were debt traps. And I said, you haven't been there, have you, to understand that there was tangible progress about the development of railways, for example. And so I think that's the main thing that underlines my work. But yeah, I'm moving towards this.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone, for introducing yourselves. I'm conscious I want to open the space up to the audience, but quite selfishly I've invited all of these people because I'm interested in all of their work, and these are questions that I've been grappling with when I was doing my undergrad here, but also in my decolonisation work in the organisation. And just listening to everyone speak, what I've really noticed is that there feels like a pull between like engaging with institutions in like practicing decolonising education, but also a draw away from that to really hone in on work coming from and being produced by people from the ground, from the bottom up. And it'd be interesting to hear, anyone can kind of answer this as they want to hear where people understand, like whether people see it as like a contradicting kind of dynamic, or one that can be used alongside each other, and how that can be used as how using grassroots movements and institutions can work together if possible when we engage with institutions that are deeply colonial. Also, when I ask questions, I like to hear the thoughts of people in the audience. So if there are thoughts that have come up to you while you've been listening to the talk, or as I've been asking this question, feel free to share.
I'm happy to kick off answering. Just through my own personal experience,
experience as being someone who has started a grassroots organisation, I like to call it a domino effect, where potentially, you start off with something that can potentially be seen as small. For me, it was just me behind my laptop trying to raise awareness about medical education across different skin tones, and that got picked up by my university, that got picked up by media outlets, that got picked up by the NHS Race and Health Observatory, and since then now I'm actively working in policy surrounding the WHO itself. So I think a lot of it is a domino effect, where sometimes you will just get picked up from smaller projects and it becomes this kind of this snowballing into something bigger. But I think what's really, really important is that you acknowledge the dynamics that are at play there when you've got something like a snowball effect. Because I had this really interesting conversation with a friend of mine who isn't involved in race, and she's involved in race theory or decolonisation, but she's involved in climate action. And again, a hugely important cause, and something that a lot of students are becoming activists in. However, we like to put, there's palatable activism and then there's non-palatable activism. And I think decolonisation sometimes teeters between that palatable and non-palatable. And the reason I say that is because the idea of just labelling colonialism is very uncomfortable for a lot of people in a lot of institutions. Because for a lot of institutions, they haven't even recognised that they are built off of colonial legacies. I mean, for the university I'm at, it was only recently that they started to recognise that, the colonial legacies very much shaped the university's policies, teaching itself, and so now it's suddenly starting to acknowledge that. So it's really, really important that when you go into a space like this, when I went into the space like this, it was packaged, for me, not really in my own words, but as anti-racism, where in reality I was going down the lens of decolonisation. And I think that's so, so important, especially with something like climate change, for example, where there is, I think, a lot of institutions and a lot of contention surrounding it, and so it means that they are suppressed, and those activists don't actually get that platform. So it's really important to understand the dynamic at play, and I think for me, I've been privileged where they have repackaged my cause into something that's decolonial, into anti-racism, which has become more palatable, and that means that snowballing was allowed to actually play out. So I think it's a paradox in itself. You're trying to question these entities and trying to question these institutions, but at the same time, sometimes your cause gets taken out of your control and you're told, actually, no, it's focusing on anti-racism, it's focusing on Black Lives Matter, it's focusing on this specific cause, when in reality your original cause was something very, in some institutions they think it's radical. Decolonisation for a lot of universities is called radical thinking. And so I think it's really important that you recognise what dynamics are at play and how you actually navigate those dynamics as well. Sometimes I think you have to play the game, and some people may agree, some people may disagree, but I think if you want to try and achieve that snowballing where you go from something small to something big, like policy change, it is really important you know who your audience is, and you know what language that what language they're comfortable with, but also challenging them and actually using language they're uncomfortable with, because without discomfort you can't make a change. And so that's how I just want to kick off the answer.
Cool, thank you. Does anyone else want to add to that? The question grappling between grassroots, but also institutional engagement, the grapple from top down, but also the desire to work from bottom up.
I think coming from the School of Oriental and African Studies, I feel like the main principle is to address decolonisation. But I feel like with the increased saturation in the conversation, the term decolonisation can get lost into translation sometimes. And so sometimes it gets repackaged into corporate jargon just to make it seem like it's virtue signaling, especially. And so I think that when you're working in grassroots movements, it can get easy to become absorbed by this sort of corporate jargon and this corporate absorption. And so I think it's really important to make sure that we keep addressing the issue. And I think that the fundamental issue within colonisation in the curriculum is that they refuse to address it. So if you look at the curriculum review released in November 2025 last year, there was no mention of race. And without the mention of race, you can't address the issue. So I think fundamentally it's just being able to navigate that sort of critic.
Yeah, I can add as well. I think they're both really, really helpful comments so far. So, thank you, Greg. I mean, you helped clarify some of my thinking. I think it's worth also looking to some of the different approaches that different theorists have on this, right? So Tuck and Yang, for example, would say that decolonisation is not a metaphor and is about the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. And so, by that definition, what we're talking about perhaps would be metaphorical, would be something other than decolonisation. Someone like Patricia Hill-Collins talks about resistance knowledge projects or resistant knowledge projects, and I think she puts decolonisation alongside a number of other resistant knowledge projects like anti-racism and feminism. And for her, she says the things that makes these resistance knowledge projects is that they are ready to challenge relations of power, right, in and through the theorising and through the knowledge creation itself. And so I think if we think in those ways, in those different ways, the relationship between grassroots movements and institution itself always shifts, because what is a grassroots movement and what is an institution can be understood differently. I mean, I often think in terms of palatability and also in terms of complicity. I think complicity is an interesting word that gets used a lot, but can be interesting to think about and think with. I think there's also the question of who is being left out, right? Like who is being erased and made invisible, even in these discussions of decolonisation. I think it's quite striking that at the University of Cambridge, even when we're talking about decolonisation, we rarely talk about service staff working within our institutions. I've not heard many or any discussions about all the people cleaning rooms in colleges, for example, which we all live in, and many of us live in, and are mandated to live in, right? Whereas I know that some of the London universities, when there was this boom in conversations about decolonisation within the university, were thinking about service staff. So there's also these differences of who is counted or not counted. And for me, I don't know that it's necessarily coincidence that the University of Cambridge, we're not necessarily thinking that broadly about who else is part of this university and also who else is part of this city, which is highly stratified along like university membership lines.
Samina, do you want to add, or I'm happy to move on to?
Yeah, maybe just a little bit. I think what Isabel's last point about the materiality is really important in terms of thinking about where resources go, where space goes, in terms of the city as well, but also how people are actually paid and can they live off what they're being paid to work in this university at different levels. I think this university is very, very hierarchical, and that's clear at every turn, right? The hierarchies that are in place. And I think it thrives of those hierarchies, right? That's why it reproduces them. At the same time, the paradox is that this university presents itself as like quite democratic, and that it has the Senate House, which is sort of a semi-democratic body that works kind of like a parliament in some ways, but then you have to be at a certain grade. So you have to be at a certain salary grade in order to be able to participate in those discussions and have a vote about the direction of the university. So there's all of these levels in which hierarchy is institutionalized. But in terms of the tension between grassroots movements versus the institution, I think what's been really telling, to be honest, has been the pro-Palestine movement and the way the university has reacted to the pro-Palestine movement, especially after 5 years of so-called commitments to anti-racism and decolonisation. The pro-Palestine movement was repressed, basically, and the university's understanding of freedom of speech and academic freedom have, caved to the government's understanding of freedom of speech and academic freedom. And I think that's a very material thing as well, right? In terms of sanctions, in terms of institutional ties outside of Cambridge, and so on and so forth. So I think if I were to think about what could be a focus for decolonizing education movements going forward, I think it's going to have to be increasingly material, because the repression we're seeing is increasingly material as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was noting that down because I really prefer to material too. Just want to open up the space to you all. Are there any questions that you have for the panel, or any comments you want to make in your own engagement with decolonial work?
Yeah, I can make a comment. So I've been working with, I've had the pleasure of working with some of the people here on like a grassroots organisation called Gaza 40 Plus, where we sort of help students in Gaza receive education and also come to the UK. And one thing we've had to grapple with is sort of working with these institutional bodies, particularly for like funding, because as a grassroots organisation it's very difficult to secure funding, especially when considering like the financial barriers of like international scholarships for like students to study here which is like, it's a demonstration of like that colonialist, imperialist sort of body that prevents and puts hurdles in place, you know, for these students. So one thing we've had to do is sort of like walk that tightrope, working with institutions, but trying to avoid being consumed by an institution itself. So we've managed to do that by like partnering up with like a charity that are registered, they are an institution, and they handle that side of the conversation of working with institutions, whereas we more so work with the actual students themselves and have like a community aspect. And I've seen that be very important in maintaining like a decolonial space. It's having like that community, having that familial feel, compared to like where you see NGOs, and NGOs seem very like, they try to be very above the board, very professional, and not as understanding to the needs and the wants of the community itself. But yeah, that was my comments.
I had just a response to Dr. Higgins and a question for the rest of the panel, because I think what's been really interesting in my experience as a student here are the ways in which these knowledge projects are contested when the seat of your knowledge, the questions that you're asking, sit outside of the white heads. So even having within your own instructions, within the people that are instructing you or guiding you in your studies, having to fight for those analytic spaces feels like a very grassroots personal decolonization task. But I have to say that I definitely relate to you, Aminata, in the sense that that's very heavy work when what you're actually trying to do is deep conceptual work or thinking or creating these knowledge projects. And so I would love to know, I understand that the curriculum didn't even mention race, and I'm assuming that's what level of education is that?
Secondary education.
Secondary education. But I would also be really interested in what the panel have to say about at the tertiary level. What does that decolonization look like? From a labor perspective, it then puts so much onus on a small amount of staff who in themselves are vulnerable because they're attempting to do this work. And then for those of us, I'm at the PhD level, for those of us that are looking to go into academia and do more of this work, just getting through, just getting to credentialing can feel very heavy unless you can find those other allies that are going to come in and say, for example, your supervisor isn't recognizing that blackness is worth studying, and having those people to come and back you up. So I don't know if that was really a question of comment or venting, but my real question becomes, you're talking about grassroots, but at what level? Because what I'm describing is a micro level intervention, but it's going to have macro systems if we can get more people through these credentialing levels that can then join these institutions. And then the other part of it is the dynamic, the labor dynamic, because then it might be 10 professors in a university that even understand what you're talking about, and 1,000 students trying to get to it.
Yeah, would anyone like to respond to either comments?
I think what we're kind of getting at is who's going to do the advocacy if everyone's got something to do, essentially. So I think the work of that essentially empowering students to do that themselves, and it sort of carries them on throughout the year. So I'm going to take my case, for example. My brother goes to the same school that I did the French one, and so me teaching him about his own history sort of, I mean, it's not the best solution, but he's able to advocate for himself when in a space where he has no other allies. And so when he moves into spaces where he has other allies, he's sort of able to sort of horizontally teach them and then create a greater movement. And I think that's what's worked throughout the secondary schools, and especially at university for me. So if you look at other frameworks like Afro-Caribbean societies, for example, I think especially at the SARS one, we've done quite a good job of being able to sort of establish the issue and then like coalesce and create a group for us to be able to go speak to university administration. And I understand that it's a very like charged thing, people have things to do, but so far that's the only solution we've been able to find whereby we don't get shot down by like university administration essentially.
Yeah, any other thoughts?
I'm just going to mention, speaking on that, you made some really good points, and I really love the question that you made because it's something that reminded me of a similar. So I went to a similar event in Parliament, which was about decolonising women, and it was a majority South Asian, Sikh, Punjabi population that did attend the event, and we had a very similar question where it was, you know, how much are we expecting, for example, undergraduates to do in terms of decolonisation, where they're tackling their own curriculum anyway. On top of that, they have to then start challenging the curriculum and actually saying, no, these are different avenues we need to go down, these are different avenues we need to teach. And I think I found that myself, you know, doing medicine itself is it's a hard course, it's a hard degree, it's 5 years, but then on top of that, having to navigate, you know, this part of the curriculum isn't representative enough, these are the additional resources you need to use, this is the language you need to use, these are the images you need to use. It's tiring, and I think it's very much fitting with this year's ethos for International Women's Day, which was Give to Gain. And we had a really long discussion about how that phrase itself is quite colonial, the idea that we have to give something in order to gain something, and how the giving is very much, like you said, from a minority of people, usually women of colour, usually people of colour, and how in order to gain, we constantly need to give our time, our effort, our energy, our emotional investment as well into education in order to just feel seen and to feel heard. And I think that's so important to sit with and recognise that we are giving so much to try and make sure that people are being represented properly within these institutions, but it's the onus on the institutions to actually say, okay, how can we offload some of this emotional, mental, intellectual burden to make sure that we're addressing these populations properly. And I'm hoping, you know, with a lot of grassroots work, like you said, where does the grassroots actually start? Does it start, you know, in secondary school, like you said, you're teaching your brother? Does it start at university? Does it start when you start working, when you start getting paid? I think it's a mixture of all, really. I think change can only happen when you're horizontally and vertically trying to enact change. And so, like you said earlier about community, it's really, really important that we stand in solidarity with one another and actually understand that there is a huge mental burden towards decolonising practices and decolonising institutions, because for the most part we don't get a lot of support. And so that's why panels like this are so important, and questions like that are so important, because it's like we're all, you know, without quoting High School Musical, but we are all in this together. And yes, I just wanted to make that comment.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, unless you're okay. Yeah, thank you for that, and other panelists as well. I think I have so many thoughts. I mean, one thing I think, you know, that's really important is to like register and acknowledge all of the work that so many people are doing that cannot be recognised because of the ways that the systems have been set up not to recognise certain forms of work. The comment you made about your brother reminded me of being a child, growing up in the 90s in a very, very white area, and coming home having learned about Florence Nightingale, and my mum kind of being incensed and sending me to school the next day with this book on Mary Seacole so we could talk about, you know, race and care work and nursing beyond this kind of white gaze, and it's wonderful that she did that, and I'm very grateful to her. I also don't think that she should have had to do that. She could have just focused on like being my mum at home, you know, and not trying to supplement my education. And I think that it's sad that like almost 30 years on that same dynamic remains. I think, yeah, a lot of things are going on at the same time. I mean, one of the issues with teaching, right, is that like there are certain things that gain legitimacy within this context of coloniality, and those include teaching in certain ways. There's also the question that like the longer a person might remain in a certain type of institution, the more they might become used to the norms or practices of that institution. One of my undergraduate students from about 3 or 4 years ago reminded me the other day that I used to play a Burna Boy song from 2019, Another Story, at the beginning of all of my teaching on decolonisation. And I forgot that I did that, because now I don't play songs because I'm so busy it doesn't occur to me. But they were like, this was really like transformative for us to hear music that we already knew in an academic setting, and to feel like we could learn not only from academic sources. But that, I would say, is me becoming interpolated into this institution more and more and forgetting other things. because of the time pressures and other pressures. I also think, so what I'm trying to do here is like destable this like quote unquote colonial matrix of power. If we're thinking with the Latin American decolonial theorists, how is the like coloniality of being and coloniality of knowledge? So who do we think we can be and who do we see others as being? What do we see knowledge as being? How are those things themselves shaped by the institution, right? Like I think they're questions to ask. And I actually think a big part of it is about like this logic of ownership that underpins the institution. Like I'm just thinking like, you know, more of us could make our reading lists available online. More of us could make our teaching materials available like that. It's not a huge thing, but it, again, it's pushing back against this is my material, which we're all taught. And thus potentially offering a way in which more legitimacy for younger scholars can be, or younger scholars in their career can be gained. But again, I think these questions for me are really hard without like intergenerational conversation, and not just generational like age-wise, but into career level conversation. And so yeah, really grateful for this space because it's reminding me of the experiences of people at different career stages. And important to think about how we can all be of more value to one another.
Yeah, thank you for that question and for sharing your experience. I hear you basically. It's really difficult and it can feel really isolating actually, I think for me on a personal level, I was so lucky that my mentors had gone through what you're describing a generation and a bit before, so it's again that intergenerational thing. So there was already that space for me there to feel free to engage with radical knowledge in the way I wanted, but not everyone has that. And especially at PhD level where your supervisor has so much power over you, that can be really, really difficult. And in the UK system especially, you basically have one or two supervisors and that's it. And if those people, they basically can put boundaries around what kind of knowledge you can make. And I've heard this from other friends too, that that's definitely something that's happening in the university. What I would say to that is to build community. It's really difficult, but it's easier when you have like a community of people who can reinforce your own instinct that what you want to do is the right thing to do, basically. Like the questions you want to ask are worth asking, and the way you want to ask them is worth pursuing. I think that's really important to be like in a peer group of some sort in that sense. And to also know that you are absolutely right to advocate for yourself. And this is your project at the end of the day. Like if you're going to commit 4 years of your life to something, it has to be meaningful to you in some kind of deeper sense. But I also got this kind of backlash, not in this university, but more broadly, about trying to talk about race in East Europe, which is imagined as this homogenous space, which it's not, but that's how it's imagined, where people are telling me, like, why do you talk about whiteness? There's no whiteness in East Europe. Crazy. But, you know, I mean, in this group, it can seem like a crazy thing to say, but people actually believe that, right? And that can be a really difficult thing to do, but I think with time, I found the people that were having the conversations I wanted to be a part of. And that happened on an academic level through reading, to be honest. Like just reading beyond what was available to me here and looking for the kind of space in the literature that I wanted to be a part of and could see myself in. And it was a huge privilege that my supervisors encouraged that and allowed that. But I heard from others as well that, you know, when you're going to this level of to being evaluated, right? Your MPhil dissertation, your PhD dissertation, even your undergrad dissertation, you are being held against a standard, right? And that standard doesn't come out of thin air, like Iska was just explaining. So, yeah, I think it's definitely slightly better than it was like in 2016 when we first came here, but there's still, especially in different parts of the university, like we're talking about from a very like social science background, but in different parts of the university trying to have these conversations can feel really isolating, I think, and I totally hear you in that respect. And I would agree with you that this is a grassroots activity, right? Like pushing back and creating the space for the sort of questions you want to ask, I think is grassroots activity. So yeah, I don't have any necessarily good answer, but I definitely know that other people are going through this experience as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to pull some thoughts together from everyone. Just so many things going through my mind that I really agree with, and really quite keen to like jump between like things that were coming to mind when like understanding the work of Gaza 40, which is doing like really, really great decolonial practice, like actually affording people within like colonial centres the opportunity to education, and the difficulties of like navigating institutional red tape, which is also something that academics are struggling with constantly in trying to decolonise their academic spaces, and the kind of the labour that's present in both of them is so large. Like something that's so brilliant about this grassroots movement is how like just active students have been in just saying like these are the things that we need to get done to have a tangible impact. So this is what decolonisation in our work looks like. It's making sure people can actually get to the country without biomedical scanning, and having like a tangible goal in the different pockets of decolonial work, I think is what's really important. Like what in like a small collective that you get to find does decolonising education look like, because you can't do it all. You can take one segment, like I know like Lola Olafemi did brilliant work in trying to decolonise the education side of the English faculty in Cambridge. And so looking at that is really brilliant, and also pulling back to the conversation of people beyond the people that we see as as having the primary responsibility for doing decolonisation work in the ways that we typically understand it in like reframing where knowledge should be produced. What comes to mind for me is the fact that I have a sister who's very, very passionate about teaching primary school children, and having had similar lived experience to I think a lot of us in this room, she was very passionate about making sure the students that she had got to have an education that looked beyond just whiteness, just beyond heteronormative living. And so her daily practice as a teacher was just making sure that students had access to books that she didn't have when she was a child, and being willing to have the dialogue with those students who are just so tiny. And that in itself is like decolonial work that is so incredibly valuable in the way that the work that everyone here on this panel is doing, I'm sure others here as well. And I think that what comes to mind for me is the idea of like ownership of work. Who do we understand has ownership of work? Where do we see our responsibility in showing different kinds of people that they can own this kind of work, so that it's not just, decolonial work isn't just rerouted over and over again in like academic elites, because that in itself reproduces colonial practice. Those are things that were coming to mind when I want to bounce off, but also if people want to veer the conversation, ask a few more questions.
I was going to ask, I feel like a lot of what you guys have been talking about has been about like decolonising thought and like theory, which is obviously so important. And like I think it's interesting, like your perspective from like kind of like medicine background. Like I feel like social sciences, like my experience with like geography, like it's quite woke, I guess, like well they pretend to be woke. But I just think it's funny, like definitely here there's a real STEM humanities divide. I think it's probably the same with most universities. Like I've got something to get the engineering department, and I was just thinking about engineering department. I was like, that's just like complete like another world that they have. I know they just have like so much money invested in like arms and stuff. And like, yeah, I guess it comes back to what you guys were saying about materiality as well as like thought, and just like I don't know how to approach. Like if you guys have thoughts on approaching like there's so much validity in like doing this decolonising work on education, of course, but like how to, I don't know how to link that up with like the real, like not the real, obviously it's the real, but like the like material, like yeah, like just the like horrific like ways that I guess like our institution and other institutions are still like materially colonial and like still like literally engage in like giving money to like colonial regimes. I guess would be like how to link those two together. If you guys have thoughts. that work, like trying to get the university to divest from investment. People are doing this work in various ways and in different areas of the university, but it's going to take a lot of chipping from different points to get an institution disenfranchised to do anything. But yeah, I think it's important to recognize that people are doing that work and are doing it behind the scenes with little recognition, and at the same time, it's work that requires a lot of endurance, because of course a university that's 800 years old is going to be very resistant. You know, it's going to have its walls very thickly clad, so to speak, in terms of resistance. But one thing that comes to my mind, I think it's really important to keep remembering that this is not the only things can be, you know, and that we can divest from arms, we can break institutional ties with communist genocide and with states that are perpetuating genocide. I think that's really important to keep saying that over and over, you know, and to not like lose sight of the goal, because I think it's really easy to get discouraged maybe, or to get hopeless, or to leave the university, because of course life moves on and student cycles are relatively short in comparison to the university's lifespan. But yeah, I think it's really important to keep the pressure up. Even that means like writing 1 million open letters every few years and going to 100 protests that look exactly like one another, you know. It's just to say, actually, there are people here who believe in this and who don't agree with the university's complicity in genocide. So yeah, from my perspective, that's what I've seen be really helpful, and that's what I'm aiming and trying to keep being involved with.
I think speaking of what you said about like legacies and making sure things are sustained, I think you made a really good point about the students' lifespan at university, or students' not lifespan, but students' time at university is minimal compared to how long the institution has been around for. I think looking at it from a microscopic level and macroscopic level is really important in decolonisation. So for us, we at the university have set up the first type of recurrent decolonisation conference, where we've got student rep, we've got faculty who are constantly having conversations throughout the year saying, let's add this to the conference, let's add this to the conference, and we're adding more and more interdisciplinary thinking. So it was originally a medical conference, now it is a multidisciplinary conference that includes people from the humanities as well as STEM, which I think is really, really powerful. And I think for a lot of people who either fully established within the activism space or are just getting started, it can be quite intimidating thinking that there's one type of way of being activist or one type of way of being decolonizer. You know, it isn't always just, you know, writing petitions or going out with placards. It is actually saying to your professor, can we sit down and have a conversation about this? It is talking to your peers and saying, what, you know, a conference like this, would that be interesting? Would people actually attend it? Because you can have one person change the way that they're thinking around STEM or around humanities and decolonisation, and I think we've done the job. So it's always worth just looking at a macro level and then actually saying, well, how can it make a difference on a macro level?
Yeah, if we take one more question on the that'd be great.
So I'm not sure if mine is a question or more of a thought that I was having, just like kind of amnesia and how much kind of work on these things has been done in the past. And I was kind of thinking about that with regards to particularly the university and the short, like the students have at the university, and the kind of like problem of how people do this work, and it's forgotten. And well, of course it's not forgotten. So, but anyway, I was just thinking about that.
Yeah. Something that really
History is
it's something that really excites me about the archival work that Isabel was talking about, because what I've really noticed is that there's such a cyclical nature in Cambridge University and sure in other student organising movements, particularly. That's my background of work, where it feels like we're constantly starting again, because we have really incredible organisers who do great work while they're here, who focus on doing the work, but don't do the archival work, and don't have the structures to be able to actually do the knowledge sharing, to be able to ensure that the work keeps happening once they leave. And so the archival work is really brilliant because it means that we actually get to see the histories of the work that have happened before us, the progress we've made, and when our strategy hasn't been effective. And something that I've been thinking about a lot, in like some of the people in this room and people that I organise with, is how we incentivise really passionate young organisers to learn to do more of the like gritty administrative work of maintaining movements, which is making sure we sit down and have like knowledge sharing with people and skill sharing, so that you, in doing decolonial work, are actually decentering yourself from the very beginning. I think that's really, really difficult in institutions like Cambridge, because we've all come here because we want to change the world. And so it feels important to us that we hold on to the work we're doing and actually entirely eradicating ourselves from over time, I think is the most effective thing we could actually do. And us sharing those histories is really important to that. I think. Yeah, I was wondering if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I'd really like to speak to that and like the importance of alumnus networks as well. So I think across secondary school and university, contacting alumni and basically talking to them about the struggle, you tend to realise that it is just the same with basic issues. So I think one of the biggest moments for that was talking to people and, you know, like this, yes, they're like, oh, it hasn't changed much, has it? But I feel like formalising those connections between people who have previously been there allows for a facilitated transfer of knowledge that I don't think needs to happen to as often as we should do. So I think networks like 10,000 Backtrack like interns put people into contact with people who've been in the industry for years. And well, in conversations you tend to realise that nothing has changed, but it also gives people avenues and mediums to sort of mitigate their circumstances and just find ways to move forward given the institutional constraints. So that's one of the ways I think we can circle.
I guess I can just add and say one of the interesting things, so we've been trying to get a sense of everything that's been done publicly on the web from 2016 till now related to decolonisation or tagged with decolonisation across the collegiate university. And so, and soon we will be making this a thing that everyone can access to look at what there is. And one of the things that's really interesting is thinking about different types of work. So there is work that I would call like direct action, right? Like protests, encampments, teach-ins. There is also work that is different, that is like more within the structure of the institution. So people organising a conference or an event or changing a reading list. And then there's another kind of work which is like the funneling of resources, material or other resources into change. So the libraries having new funds to buy new kinds of books, new kinds of roles actually being funded by the university. And it's interesting because all of those things have all been happening. And I think we lose track of some of them more easily than others. Some of them become kind of less quote-unquote radical or revolutionary than they could be more quickly than others. But I think if we can look at things that have already happened, it really allows us to think historically about like where the institution, and not only this institution, but this institution in relation to a wider higher education context, and a wider national and international context, right? Like, you just flag, you know, this is occurring in a context in which colleagues in the US are not able necessarily to do this work and have had their funding cut up. We are in a very complicated time for this work to be taking place, so I think the more we can do to archive, and one of the reasons like what Samina and Ali do with capitalists, I mean, it's, yeah, thinking in that long historic way about these questions, I think is super helpful as well.
Yeah, any other thoughts before I round out?
Yeah, I think this is so important. I mean, I just realized this morning when Isabel spoke, I totally forgot that Lorena's letter was so foundational to everything that was happening then in 2017, I think it was. Because I don't know, your brain just forgets things, and the university is actively trying to like make it go away, right? So I think even for us, those people who are interested in these questions, it's important to have a sense of the genealogy and the work that's gone before us to make this possible, to make this conference possible, to make, you know, the conversations that we are having now possible. And another area in this university where I think we can do a little bit more to keep our eyes on the ball is the legacies of enslavement inquiry and what's come out of that, and the way the university we're supposed to, channel funds into different things, and now it's the Legacies on Statement Special Initiative, I think it is. So we just did an event last week about this with the Catalyst Lab, but I think it's important for multiple groups to keep staying focused on this issue and keep the university accountable to what they said they would do with regards to the Legacies on Statement here and in our city as well. So yeah, I think it's really important to have a sense of the historical trajectory of things, both in the short term, so what's happened like in the past 20 years, maybe before us being here, but also in the really long term of the constitution of this university as a sort of heart of empire.
Brilliant, thanks so much. I just wonder if there are any final closing things that people feel really cool to share with the audience on this before I do. I think it's something maybe let people have something. Brilliant. I mean, did you want to say something? I mean, I think they've shared incredible stuff, and some of them will be lingering, so feel free to, feel free to have a chat with them, not to put them on the spot. It's been really interesting to hear everyone's thoughts. I'm also conscious of you wanting to run off. Do you still need to run off?
No, I misread my calendar. I actually need to be somewhere else at 12:30.
It's okay. Okay. Just lots of the core tenets, I think, of all the speakers and contributors today. I think I've really created a helpful framework of what decolonising work can really look like in different spaces, not just in education but beyond that. It feels like there are 4 key components to effective organising for decolonisation. One, ensuring that there is enough resource for work, ensuring there are spaces in which there are sympathetic individuals within organisations that are willing to fund work, even if not specifically involved in decolonial work. Then institutional, internal work, where internal bodies, staff members are doing the chip away kind of work from the inside, looking at our governance, our compliance, our policy across various spaces, and also our strategic practice within education, like reading this as one of the panelists mentioned. But also the more grassroots, external, oppositional work, where individuals that have more risk appetite are able to do that kind of external pushing that people from internal can use to say this is emotional sentiment that people care about, but I sympathise and I'm willing to support your work internally if you recognise these voices externally. I think that's really important. And then finally, archiving of all that work so we can continue from the work that's already happened as opposed to starting from an initial basis. Thank you so much all for sharing your work and for doing all the work you're doing. It's so valuable, and thank you all for taking the time to listen because you care about this work. We could just give them a round of applause. We're now going to take a break for lunch, but we were going to start again at 1. We'll probably start just after 1, maybe 5, 10 past 1, if that's okay. Lunch is provided at the front of the lounge, and feel free to move to that space. It's a tiny sound. There are prayer spaces just to the left of the lounge, so feel free to use that too.
We have to accept that she's a bad course. It'll be fine, like honestly. Don't worry about it.
Thank you so much.